长。每一个人都有想去的地方，有时候天使不回答，也许只是因为心还不够渴望。我擦干泪水，再一次出发。我在漫漫长夜之中飞翔，寻找属于我的那道星光。明明知道城市容易受伤，我不害怕，我不害怕，我要奔向我心底的远方。亲手拥抱最美好的时光，路上难免也会迷失方向。我不害怕，我不害怕，拥有梦的人，世界多么疯狂都不害怕，我不害怕。
Good morning, everybody. I hope this video finds you well. Today, what I want to talk about is the second part of my basic series on our reality universe. Basically, this is the mechanism of how everything that you see around you and feel and interact with works. In this particular video, what we are going to do is look at the connections between individual world lines that lie on and around the world line template, which I have illustrated earlier, resembles the surface of an ocean. So this particular video talks about how they're connected, how individual world lines are connected to each other. In my previous discussions and my writings, I always showed this mesh, hexagonal mesh, square meshes, triangular meshes, forming a static, fixed, geometric topography. And while that is very helpful to visualize things, that's not exactly true. And in this video, we're going to see exactly how it works. Because as I've said earlier in the last video, when you have a lot of people in the MWI and they're all thinking different things, and it doesn't even mean people, insects and mice and elephants and horses and everything's thinking things, the water tends to be choppy and undulating. And therefore, this mesh that I have drawn before is actually constantly moving, and I showed that in the previous video. You see it constantly moving. And here, how can those, the question arises, how can those connections between world lines still exist when the surface undulates in such a manner? And we're going to go look at it right now. So before we go any further, I want to address that one point. The first thing that we must face and recognize is that these world lines, and again, it's a terrible term, but it's something that people can easily grasp. It's just a frozen moment in space. We call it a world line because that's in science fiction, that's where you travel to a world line and then start a different life or a new adventure. It's always the point of where you start your vector experiences. But so when you enter onto a world line and you move forward, that is what we've been talking about. And the truth is, these lines that connect these various world lines are constantly changing as the surface topography, or as I call it, the template, is constantly moving about like waves on an ocean. We also see that these connections form and fall apart. They disappear and reappear as things occur. So let's look a little bit closer as to what I'm actually talking about. Here we are looking at the surface of water. And in our case, this is exactly what the surface boundary looks like on the reality universe. It looks like a series of undulating waves. And in the case of looking at a pool, a swimming pool, you will see that there are these lines, these bright white lines that seem to be continually changing, continually moving about. And then there are points where the intersections of these lines are. Where these lines intersect is known as a world line. And the connection points, or these lines that you visually see, is the shortest path from one world line to the other. Those are the lines that I have drawn up in my earlier discussions on the mesh surface of the world line template. So this imagery that you're witnessing right now is what the actual surface of the ocean, of the reality universe looks like. It's not so nice and neat as squares or hexagons, is it? It's continually changing due to thoughts and stability relative to those thoughts. So, how can you anchor yourself? Well, what happens is you inject your consciousness in a specific point, a world line where these intersections occur, and then you travel, as you think, along the most highest probable white line that you see. That is the most probable, the highest probability of moving based upon your thought projections. As you're born, of course, your initial thought projections are laid out for you. But as time goes on, you start creating them for you, and it's no longer that default. That's why we say that we're living in a fated universe. You can alter your fate, but it's the easiest thing to do is go ahead and deal with the fate that you have been handed. Now, we should give these lines, these white lines that you see undulating in front of your screen, a name. Actually, they have a name, but if I use that name, it'll confuse you all. For now, let's just call them a swale. Just like we refer to the swales that connect the garbons in soul construction. So these white lines are swales that are actually the easiest path for consciousness to travel upon when traveling upon the surface of the reality universe. Another thing that you will take note is that the intersections of these lines are not a point. I have always illustrated them as a sphere or a point, but they're not really. Instead, it's a collection of, or a peak of light intensity. And when you travel to this world line, you are traveling into the highest probability peak location as determined by your thoughts relative to the template. And we refer to that as a world line. So as you can see, you have graduated from the simplistic narrative that world lines are simple lines that go to these spheres like some kind of geometry, to something that is much more dynamic and to something that is much more interesting and varied and variable. There's so much more, of course, that we can talk about. Like, what's the higher density aspects of this reality? That as you go deep into this pool of reality, and then what are the later aspects when you fly up and above this reality? But we're not going to dwell on that right now, so don't get too caught up. In reality, we're just talking about the surface, the choppy surface of the MWI, this reality universe that you inhabit. Our minds want things to be well understood and clear, and therefore there's no need at this point in time, to get involved in too many technical aspects of this. But the illustration should serve you enough to understand how the MWI works, how world line traveling works, and what a world line is. And of course, seeing what you see right now should make it perfectly clear that when you land upon a world line, it's not exactly as pristine as you would like it to be. In fact, it's rather nebulous. In fact, as your consciousness enters into this world line, it's more like a chalkboard that you can write upon rather than something that's solid and fixed. And that is a subject for another day. But for right now, look at the beauty of the simplicity of what the MWI is, because this is the way it works, guys. You might also notice that sometimes, or many times, that these white swales, these highlighted areas, these swales, disappear. And you might be stuck on a world line. Well, world lines are only momentary. And in the event that the swale becomes lighter or disappears, doesn't mean that you're trapped on that world line. Instead, you still follow the highest probability route to the next world line. Which means, of course, that some of these world lines may not be desirable. And that's where thoughts and vocalizations come into play, because they guarantee that the world line path that you take is always clearly defined and easy to follow. And that's why that when you do your verbal affirmations and you run campaigns, that things actually happen. Let's observe this topographical undulating surface that really and seriously resembles waves on an ocean. As you watch the waves undulate, and you can imagine yourself floating on top of these waves, it's very easy to believe that your directions are only upon that surface. But in reality, it's not only upon that surface. That surface represents highest probability of manifestation, and it's not a clean surface as it appears. It's actually more like a thick sponge. And you travel to other world lines within this membrane, this surface. Sometimes you're directly on the surface, sometimes you're a little bit under the surface. It all depends on thoughts. Those of you who are familiar with my earlier writings know that you can certainly go higher up, way above the surface of this terrain, or way down below that surface of terrain, depending upon your thoughts. By doing the unexpected, you will naturally migrate off this surface. This surface is only the highest probability of world line travel based upon your known behaviors and thoughts. If you suddenly deviate from that, do something unexpected from that, do something out of character from that, you immediately leave that surface and suddenly find yourself in other environments. You will find, in general, that if you're doing helpful actions towards other consciousnesses, you will find yourself riding above the waves, entering into the airy space that is above the ocean. While if you concentrate on yourself and your previous experiences and your normal desires as a person living within a physical realm, you go beneath that surface. And that talks about sentience, service to others versus service to self. And we're looking upon this sentience as a driving factor on navigational ability in regards to your consciousness in this reality. Whew, God, I sound like some kind of college professor. Gosh darn it. Basically, what I'm trying to say, guys, is for you to control your reality, you have to start thinking in terms of higher purpose. Higher purpose flies you above the surface. Lower purpose, baseline survival modes, greed and all the lust and all that stuff puts you under the surface. And as density increases, like I said before, as density increases under the surface, the world lines get closer and closer together relatively, and your behaviors become fixed and much more difficult to extract yourself from. So if you're living a life that you're not too happy with right now, you might consider that your topographical surface is actually underneath the optimum, and you need to rise back up to something more to your liking, something easier, something more desirable. At the bare minimum, you want to be floating on the surface, monitoring what you're doing, and doing good works. Good works in itself, don't think of it in terms of rewards, but think of it in terms of just being a good all-around person. And benefits of being a good all-around person should be obvious.
挣扎。每一个人都有想去的地方，有时候天使不回答，也许只是因为心还不够渴望。我擦干泪水，再一次出发。我在漫漫长夜之中飞翔，寻找属于我的那道星光。明明知道城市容易受伤，我不害怕，我不害怕，我要奔向我心里的远方。亲手拥抱最美好的时光，路上难免也会迷失方向。我不害怕，我不害怕，拥有梦的人，世界多么疯狂都不害怕。我不害怕，想在你面前放光芒，想看见你为我骄傲的模样。我只有1分钟悲伤，然后微笑就把挫折都遗忘。一定有幸福在我的前方。我在漫漫长夜之中飞翔，寻找属于我的那道星光。明明知道城市容易受伤，我不害怕，我不害怕，我要奔向我心里的远方。亲手拥抱最美好的时光，路上难免也会迷失方向。我不害怕，我不害怕，拥有梦的人，世界多么疯狂都不害怕。一闪一闪星星亮了，一闪一闪给我希望。不知不觉我热泪盈眶。我在漫漫长夜之中飞翔，寻找属于我的那道星光。明明知道城市容易受伤，我不害怕，我不害怕，我要奔向我心里的远方。亲手拥抱最美好的时光，路上难免也会迷失方向。我不害怕，我不害怕，抬起头来泪就不会落下，扬起嘴角我就不再彷徨。跟着心里最想要的愿望，越过高山，越过海洋。我也相信生命终要天亮，我也相信痛苦里有宝藏，有个明天正在等我抵达。我在路上，正在路上，拥有梦的人，路有多长都不害怕，我不害怕。